The taste of ozone was sharper than the recycled air should allow. Eris felt the low-frequency hum of the stabilizers fighting the debris field, a vibration that ran up his spine and settled behind his eyes. He watched the final 3 indicator lights on the Kryptos unit's console. Green, green, green. 30 astronomical units was a safe margin, theoretically, but theory meant nothing out here. The historic Vector protocol demanded instant termination if instability was detected anywhere near the protected perimeter. Eris knew the drill. Launch the M3 stabilizer, confirm the electromagnetic pulse, and wait for the calculated energy strike that would turn his unit and everything in a 50-kilometer radius into white-hot plasma. That was the price of certainty. He breathed once, held it, and initiated the dispersal sequence. The single amber light switched to solid green, signaling the stabilizer was deployed and functioning perfectly at the designated coordinates within the Kuiper gap. A low burst of energy, too faint for standard detection, raced back towards the waiting fleet perimeter. This was the all-clear signal. This was his confirmation of success. Then the universe went silent. Not vacuum silent, but manufactured silent. Every navigation screen aboard the Kryptos unit flashed white and died simultaneously. The comms link didn't fail. It collapsed into a wall of grinding, harsh white noise, pure, coordinated static that screamed in his helmet. The expected energy strike never came. Eris didn't scramble for the manual override. That was the first clue something was fundamentally wrong. Any normal sense of failure demanded immediate lockdown and a manual system reboot. But Eris just watched the dead, milky white screens, his focus laser-locked on the small independent payload indicator. It was still solid green. The cure was out. The stabilizer was functioning. The fleet should have vaporized him 3 seconds ago. A cold sweat coated his neck, sharp, sudden. Not the sweat of fear, but of absolute crushing realization. They hadn't missed. They hadn't malfunctioned. They jammed. The static wasn't a failure. It was an acoustic weapon, a blanket of noise designed to destroy all telemetry, drowning out his status reports and, critically, their own ability to lock and fire. Why? Jamming the zone destroyed their certainty. They didn't want him dead immediately. They wanted him silenced, drifting, functionally gone. He ran a gloved hand over the cold, scarred metal of the console. This metal had been pristine 3 months ago. The shame burned sharper than the fear of plasma fire. He had been so focused on the technical perfection of the launch, on the honor of the mission, that he had ignored the glaring moral calculus. He was the only witness. He wasn't a pilot testing a cure. He was a scapegoat delivering a package. And now the package was delivered, and the execution was compromised. Eris remembered the smell of the sterile lab on orbital platform Nomara, the metallic taste of cheap, synthetic coffee, the deep exhaustion when Dr. Hilara finally cracked the M3 formula. He could almost hear the dry cough of his younger brother, Leos, haunted by the neurological rot that had already claimed a quarter of the outer colonies. They needed a field test, a sacrificial lamb to prove the stabilizer wouldn't mutate further when dispersed into the infected dust of the Kuiper Gap. Eris had volunteered, not for glory, for Leos. He had convinced himself that this suicide run, this single, final act of duty, would atone for the failures of his past life, the life before he became a nameless pilot waiting for a fireball. He was a fool, a pawn. He hadn't deployed a cure. He delivered a target. He moved not with the panic of a trapped man, but with the trained, surgical efficiency of someone used to operating under extreme concealment. He ignored the dead main console, reaching instead beneath the main environmental control unit. There was a narrow access panel secured by 3 friction screws. Standard-issue pilots never knew it existed. Eris pulled a thin, woven data cable from a sheath hidden beneath the cuff of his flight suit, connecting it to the hidden port. This wasn't fleet hardware. This was old gray market, highly illegal stealth tech, a Revenant uplink. It provided 0 navigation, 0 comms, but it gave him one thing: passive internal diagnostics, divorced from the fleet's centralized operating system. The small, cracked Revenant display flickered to life, bathing his face in a faint green light, barely cutting through the darkness of the bridge. The first readout was incomprehensible. It wasn't zero-gravity drift. The Kryptos unit was slowly accelerating, being pulled by a phantom gravitational source. He checked the acceleration data logs. 0 propulsion detected from his own engines. He checked the external stress points. Subtle, non-linear pressures exerted on the hull. The fleet wasn't chasing him. They were towing him. They weren't using tractor beams, which would have been easily detectable and loud. They were using microgravity perturbations, controlled remotely and slowly, reeling the unit in. They wanted him whole. They wanted the unit. The realization hit him with a physical shock wave. The fleet didn't want the M3 stabilizer destroyed. They wanted to retrieve it, dissect it, and control its distribution. This was never a test run. It was a handover, and Eris was now a liability being quietly recovered, scheduled for silent deletion once they had him secure. The political ramifications, the profits, the power of holding the only cure, it was enough to dismantle decades of protocol. His hands, which had been steady under the threat of impending death, now shook slightly with contained fury. He wouldn't allow the cure to become a weapon or a commodity for the oligarchs who controlled the fleet. He had to burn the towing unit out, and he had to do it now before they pulled him past the palace perimeter. He forced a diagnostic override through the Revenant link, bypassing 3 decades of safety protocols. He began feeding a spike of unfiltered core power back through the energy coupling port, the same port the unseen towing units were likely latching onto. He felt the heat rising in the floor panels, smelling the sharp electrical stink of overloaded components. This was reckless. This would kill the unit's ability to ever reach critical velocity again. But reckless was the only currency he had left. The console beeped once, a high-pitched shriek of protest that momentarily pierced the white noise in his ears. The Kryptos unit bucked violently as the unseen tow anchors dropped their hold. The acceleration data flatlined. He was drifting again. Truly adrift now, but free of external control. He had bought himself time and space, but the price was critical systems failure, success. But the Revenant uplink, dying from the power surge and the strain of being forced to operate outside its parameters, flashed one last cryptic message before the green light finally winked out. It was a burst of residual data, something that had slipped through the jamming before the whole system cooked itself. It wasn't fleet transmission data. It was an encrypted, non-human energy signature originating from far deeper in the gap, pinging the exact coordinates of the deployed stabilizer. Someone else knew the cure was out there, someone operating beyond the reach of the fleet's coordinated silence. Eris leaned back against the seat restraints, the static screaming in his helmet, the ghost of the strange energy ping burning into his memory. He wasn't just alone. He was bait. He reached for the emergency patch kit, knowing the ship needed to go completely dark. The man who had been Pilot Eris, the self-sacrificing fool, was gone. Only the cold, precise ghost of a covert operative remained. He knew how to disappear. He knew how to fight blind. He knew exactly what kind of failure he had been trained to handle. He just needed to remember who he really was. The white noise didn't cease, but Eris learned to filter it, allowing the constant high-pitched scream to settle into a dull, grinding pressure behind his eyes. He disconnected the burnt Revenant uplink, the scorched plastic stinging his nostrils with the sharp odor of fried silicon. Success had been purchased with fire. The Crypto's unit was crippled, drifting, but it was his again. His immediate priority wasn't to escape the zone, which was impossible without propulsion, but to achieve absolute silence. He needed to be colder, harder, and quieter than the vacuum. He began the systemic decommissioning process, bypassing the automated checklists which would have broadcast his status to the fleet. First, the exterior running lights, a simple circuit break, requiring a manual cut behind the environmental control panel. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the emergency low-voltage glow of the pressure gauges. His hands, steady now, moved with a practiced grace that belied the cheap components he was handling. This wasn't piloting. This was field amputation. He found the spare patch kit, thick, adhesive strips of carbon alloy, and began sealing the microfractures in the unit's hull caused by the power surge. Each movement was precise, economical, driven by a deep, cold reservoir of training that felt older than his life as a pilot. He remembered the smell of rain on scorched earth, not the sterile scent of space. He remembered the metallic tang of real terrestrial blood, not recycled ozone. That was the ghost of the man who had failed once before, a man named Kai, who used to operate beyond the perimeter with a team known only as the Ghosts, special assets the fleet always denied existed. The guilt of that former life had driven him to volunteer for this suicide mission, believing a final, noble sacrifice would pay the debt. Fool! There was no nobility out here, only physics and leverage. Aris forced a diagnostic sweep on the impulse engines, praying for residual energy. He watched the flickering gauges, 42% efficiency dropping fast, enough to maneuver slightly, maybe adjust drift, but nowhere near enough for a burn toward safety or to change his trajectory significantly. He was locked into a slow decaying orbit relative to the Cure's deployment site. He heard the subtle acoustic shift through the hull before the static changed. The white noise, the coordinated blanket of sound, suddenly developed an underlying rhythm. Thump, pause. Thump, pause. It was not random interference. It was a search pattern. The fleet was adjusting their jamming array, transforming the blanket of noise into a pulsed sonar field designed to map the density of the Kuiper Gap debris field and, critically, any non-natural object moving within it. They were not just trying to silence him, they were trying to hear him. Aris froze, his gloved hand resting mid-air above the engine override. If they detected even the slight energy output of the crippled impulse drive, they would know his general location within kilometers. He disabled the engines completely, forcing the unit into zero power drift. The unit responded with a deep, silent coldness. Now, the only thing moving him was inertia, and the slow, erratic pull of distant gravity wells. He accessed the remnant data flash from the dying Revenant link, projecting the coordinates onto the only surface he could use, a sheet of polished durasteel bolted beneath the main chair. The fleet's general coordinates were a vast cylindrical kill zone around the Kuiper Gap perimeter. The coordinates of the M3 stabilizer were a precise point near the core of that cylinder. But the non-human energy signature, the strange burst that had pierced the jamming, originated from a region 30 degrees off-axis, far deeper into the unknown reaches of the gap. The realization settled in his gut like ice. The stabilization agent, the cure, was not merely a political commodity the fleet wanted to retrieve. It was a beacon. He remembered the sterile lab, not with the exhaustion of success, but with the sudden, bitter taste of betrayal. Dr. Alara, the brilliant broken scientist who developed the M3 formula, had worked relentlessly, fueled by the desperate hope of stopping the neurological rot. Eris had seen the purity in her eyes, but purity was easily subverted. What if the M3 wasn't designed just to stabilize the bioagent, but to attract something? The idea felt monstrous, the kind of moral horror that only the High Command could sanction, to use the desperate hope of billions as bait. He thought of Leos, whose dry, rattling cough had been the constant soundtrack to Eris's self-imposed exile. That cough, that vulnerability, had been the fleet's greatest leverage. The shame of failing Leos. That was the hook. His first failure, the one that broke Kai, had been a consequence of trusting the fleet's coordinates during an extraction mission 3 years prior. They had been deliberately wrong, sacrificing Kai's team to secure a volatile military prototype. He had escaped, but the memory of Kai's final silent transmission, just heavy breathing and the sound of cracking composite, was the mortar holding Eris's sense of duty together. He would not be sacrificed again, and he certainly wouldn't let Leos's cure become part of someone else's war game. He needed intelligence, and he needed it now. The main comms array was still screaming static. The Revenant link was vaporized. But the original comms antenna, though incapable of transmission, was a massive piece of receptive hardware. If he could jury-rig the scorched input port to a functioning display, bypassing the main CPU completely, he might be able to pick up extremely low frequency, ELF, residual data, the ghost whispers that even coordinated jamming couldn't entirely erase. This required an external repair, extravehicular activity, in a dead ship, in a debris field, while a pulsed sonar field scanned for his movements. Eris forced himself to breathe, focusing on the cold metal of the oxygen valve. The EVA suit was rated for extreme vacuum, but the Kuiper Gap was a relentless environment of fine, high-velocity dust and occasional larger, ice-sheathed micrometeoroids. He sealed the cockpit and cycled the airlock, the pressure equalization a slow, agonizing process in the crippled unit. Stepping out onto the hull was stepping into absolute, unholy blackness, punctuated only by the distant cold light of the core system's sun. The static in his helmet became a pure physical wave of noise, vibrating his eardrums through the suit's internal comms. The rhythmic thump, pause, thump of the fleet sonar was louder here, a predatory pulse. He secured the safety tether, a flimsy nylon cord against the void, and began the slow, agonizing crawl along the exterior of the Kryptos unit. The hull was slick with the condensation of supercooled air. Every grip was a calculated risk. He moved towards the comm spike, a thick bundle of insulated cables near the tail section. He carried a small, heavily shielded monitor unit and a roll of industrial-grade fusion tape. The pulsed static struck the hull, and Eris felt it in his teeth, a momentary high-frequency spike that felt like a mild electrical current. He had maybe 20 minutes before the fleet's mapping algorithms would isolate the non-natural structure that was his drifting unit. Reaching the antenna housing, he fought against the cold, his thick gloves clumsy on the fine wiring. He had to cut through 3 bundles of primary cable, the transmission lines, before he reached the core optical fiber responsible for receiving deep space background radiation. He connected the low-gain receptor on his salvaged monitor unit to the fiber line. Nothing, just gray noise. He swore under his breath, the sound muted by his helmet's recirculation system. The system was too degraded. He needed to amplify the signal, and the only way to do that was to use the hull itself as a ground. He took the thin conductive wire from the fusion tape roll, stripping the insulation with his thumbnail, and wrapped it around the antenna housing, creating an improvised shunt. As he touched the final conductive surface, a violent spike of energy surged through the wiring and into his arm, not painful enough to break bone, but sharp and instantaneous, forcing a spasm that sent him sliding several meters back along the hull, caught only by the safety tether. A white flash momentarily burned the static from his vision. He fought the resulting nausea, forcing his shaking hand to check the salvaged monitor unit. The display was alive. The neural shock had paid off, amplifying the signal just enough. The screen showed 2 distinct pings. One was the steady, non-human signature from the deep gap, exactly where it had been before, near the target M3 stabilizer. But the second ping wasn't the jamming field. It was an operational unit, fast, small, and silent, a fleet scout drone running completely dark, moving past the palace perimeter and heading straight for the stabilizer's coordinates. They had deployed a recovery asset moments after Aris disabled the towing mechanism. They weren't just searching for him, they were securing the package and eliminating the witness. But the drone wasn't the worst threat. Eris zoomed the display out, tracking the movement of the non-human energy signature. It hadn't reacted to the drone, nor to Eris's power surge, but it was moving, not toward the cure, but subtly adjusting its trajectory to intersect the Cryptos unit's slow, silent drift path. The cure wasn't the bait. Eris was, and whatever was coming from the deep gap was coming for him. The white flash subsided, leaving Aris gasping inside his helmet. The neural shock had bought him precious data, but the cost of the electrical surge resonated through his bones. He fought the residual spasm in his arm, dragging himself back along the hull toward the airlock. The warmth of the recycled air inside the Cryptos unit felt like an insult after the vacuum's cold, a reminder that the life support was barely clinging to functionality. He sealed the airlock and manually repressed the inner hatch, the sound of the metal securing clicking like a death sentence. The salvaged monitor unit, still flickering with the drone's trajectory, was his only window now. Eris ripped off his gloves. His focus narrowed to the rapidly decreasing intersection time. 15 minutes until the scout drone reached his position. He needed to create a massive diversion, something that would blind the highly sensitive sensors of the fleet recovery asset, forcing it to abort, or at least slow its retrieval run. Aris forced a spike of residual energy back into the impulse engines, attempting to generate a directional magnetic field that would mimic a catastrophic internal failure, a localized explosion without the blast. This required bypassing 3 layers of thermal safety locks already damaged by his initial power surge. Attempt 1. His hands, steady through hours of surgical repair, now trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the cumulative stress. He input the override codes. The engine core responded with a high-pitched whine of protesting metal, a sound that sliced through the constant static. He waited for the magnetic field to spike, but the whine instantly flattened into a silent, dull hum. The engine core was cooked. The initial sabotage to break the tow mechanism had weakened the system too much. He had no more capacity to generate directed energy. The attempt achieved nothing but draining the last 3% of his engine charge. He was functionally immobile, a cold, heavy ghost, and the drone knew it. On the salvaged display, the drone's velocity vector shifted. It was no longer executing a general search pattern. It was accelerating, moving directly to intercept Aris's calculated drift path. The fleet had detected his power spike and was now confident in the unit's location. Aris slammed his fist onto the cold Durasteel floor, a contained burst of fury that tasted like shame. He was a fool to think a tactical move could defeat strategic malice. He had drawn the threat to himself, but gained no advantage. 9 minutes until intercept. He had one last resource, one final piece of physical engineering that could be used as a weapon: the remaining reserve coolant. Stored in massive cryogenic tanks, the super-chilled liquid was essential to prevent core meltdown, but it could also be vented, rapidly expanding into a dense cloud of frozen gas and ice particulates. If timed perfectly, a coolant vent could momentarily blind the drone's optical and thermal sensors, giving him a few crucial seconds to make an escape maneuver, however small. Attempt 2. This time, he didn't use the console. He reached for the manual bypass valves beneath the environmental control unit. He had to be quick and brutal. He used a hydraulic spanner to shear off the external pressure release cap, then forced the main feed valve open. The resulting torrent of supercooled gas was deafening, a hiss that momentarily overwhelmed the white noise in his helmet. The Kryptos unit bucked violently from the propulsion of the venting gas, sending a wave of nausea through Aris. Outside, a massive, brilliant white plume instantly solidified, a momentary comet tail that shone blindingly against the backdrop of deep space. It was a perfect thermal and visual mask. For 3 agonizing seconds, the drone ping on the monitor was gone, swallowed by the cloud. Aris held his breath, praying the drone's passive systems would be confused long enough for the slight propulsion from the venting to change his trajectory marginally. Then the drone reappeared. It hadn't stopped. It hadn't slowed. The fleet had anticipated this kind of desperate countermeasure. Instead of relying on its primary sensors, the drone had switched to a highly specialized, low-frequency mapping radar that cut straight through the ice particulate cloud. It wasn't seeing the cloud. It was mapping its density structure and using the slight visible propulsion from the venting to recalculate Aris's new, slightly altered drift path. The worst part, the white, visible plume, designed for concealment, now served as an enormous, unmistakable marker. He had fired a flare announcing his exact location to the entire system. The rhythmic thump, pause, thump of the sonar field previously subtle, became a constant, overwhelming drumbeat, vibrating the hull with brutal insistence. The fleet was focusing their coordinated search grid onto the massive, visible flare of gas. 4 minutes until intercept. Eris staggered back, the cold sweat now coating his face inside the helmet. He had gambled his remaining resources and lost both attempts, worsening the situation exponentially. The coolant reserve was gone, and his position was known. He was a beacon, a dead ship emitting a distress signal of frozen gas. He focused on the salvaged monitor, desperately trying to find a silver lining. He tracked the non-human energy signature far-off axis. It was still moving, but its speed had increased dramatically. It was moving faster than any known vessel in fleet records. The creature, or entity, or ship, was reacting to the massive energy spike of the coolant vent. It was coming for the marker. He was caught between two converging threats: the professional executioner, the drone, and the unknown hunter, the signature. Then the final devastating piece of intelligence surfaced. The salvaged monitor unit, which should have been dedicated entirely to tracking pings, flashed one last cryptic text string before the internal capacitors finally blew out, plunging the screen into permanent blackness. The message read, "Vector, protocol induced. Target, Kryptos. Reason, witness elimination. Contingency, override, active. Source, Leos." Eris stared at the black screen. The residual image of the letters burned into his sight. Leos, his brother, the reason for his sacrifice. The neurological rot victim, the man who was supposed to be saved by the cure, was somehow involved in the Vector Protocol's override. The Vector Protocol was the historic failsafe requiring instant termination of any volatile payload near the perimeter. The fleet hadn't fired because they ran a contingency override. This wasn't standard political greed. This was a deliberate, highly classified setup, and Leos was the source. Eris felt a cold, philosophical horror replace the tactical panic. Leos, coerced or manipulated, had enabled this trap. Eris's entire existence, the painful debt he thought he was paying, had been turned into a weapon against him. He wasn't just a pawn. He was a piece played against his own deepest emotional weakness. He fought the urge to scream. The fleet hadn't merely used him as bait. They had used his love for his brother. He had no engines, no comms, no sensors, and no coolant. He was drifting dead center toward the convergence point of a silent scout drone and a rapidly accelerating non-human entity. He had one system left, the auxiliary defensive microthrusters, rated only for minor hull corrections, not for evasive maneuvers. Activating them would require manually overriding the primary power safety unit, a desperate measure that guaranteed permanent system failure and likely hull breach. 2 minutes until intercept. Eris looked through the main viewing port, now fully dark, except for the distant cold stars. He saw it, the drone, a sharp, dark silhouette, less than 2 kilometers away, running cold and fast. It looked like a hunting dog closing in for the kill. He didn't hesitate this time. He couldn't allow the truth, the knowledge of Leos's coercion and the scale of the moral betrayal, to be vaporized along with the Kryptos unit. He had to get out of the immediate kill zone, no matter the final destination. He accessed the auxiliary thruster controls, bypassing the safety interlocks with a thin conductive wire he had carried since his days as Kai. His hands moved on pure muscle memory, driven by the cold necessity of revenge, not survival. He calculated a split-second 3-degree trajectory change, aiming to use a large nearby non-visible comet mass, the last known data point from the dead Revenant, to execute a high-velocity slingshot maneuver. Eris initiated the auxiliary burst. The Kryptos unit howled, a primal scream of overloading circuits. The micro-thrusters fired 3 bursts of white-hot plasma that slammed the unit sideways. The G-force pressed Eris into his seat restraints, blurring his vision and making his teeth ache. The maneuver worked. The Kryptos unit violently altered course, spinning away from the drone's path. The dark silhouette of the fleet recovery asset whipped past the viewport, missing the hull by mere meters. But the propulsion was too strong, too erratic. The unit was thrown into a wild, destabilized tumble, accelerating uncontrollably toward the pre-calculated coordinates of the comet. The drone immediately stabilized, calculating the new vector. It did not resume pursuit. Instead, the dark silhouette deployed 3 secondary tracking beacons, which locked onto Eris's wildly spinning ship. The drone then stopped, holding position, waiting. The fleet wasn't chasing him anymore. They had successfully funneled him. Eris, battered and disoriented, grabbed the control yoke, trying desperately to stabilize the tumble. He failed. The momentum was too great. He was now accelerating deep into the Kuiper Gap, directly into the unknown. He knew the direction he was heading, the path of the non-human energy signature, which must have instantly registered the massive energy output of his last desperate thrust. Eris was no longer drifting. He was flying blind and fast into the dark. And in the sudden, silent void after the thrusters died, one thought was absolute. He had just guaranteed a catastrophic collision. The bait had taken the hook, and the line was pulling taut. The centrifugal force from the uncontrolled tumble was a physical hammer blow, turning Eris's vision into a strobe of red and black. His harness strained, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth. He felt the sickening, grinding shriek of the Kryptos unit's structure fighting the G-load. He was an insect trapped in a jar, shaking violently toward a massive unknown destination. Then, silence. The momentum finally exhausted itself against the resistance of the local gravity field, throwing the unit into a slower, more erratic corkscrew. Eris hung limply in his restraints, his head throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. He blinked, trying to clear the visual static. His immediate thought was not survival, but the terrifying certainty that he was no longer operating within the bounds of physics he understood. He was accelerating by force of nature or by something far worse, and fast. He fought through the nausea, forcing his hand to the auxiliary power conduit. The primary systems were gone, the backup fried, but the small battery meant for the Revenant link still held a flicker of charge. He needed context, one final glimpse into the darkness before the collision. He ripped open the access panel and plugged the exposed wires from the burnt Revenant directly into the main diagnostics bus. A suicidal act that should have instantly vaporized the remaining charge, but Eris needed data, not safety. The small green screen flickered back to life, overloaded by the raw data feed, displaying only fragmented memory caches. He ignored the navigation data. It was useless, charting a ghost path to a non-visible comet mass. He focused on the only thing that mattered, the mission files, specifically the master log for the M3 bioagent stabilizer deployment. The file was triple encrypted, locked by the Vector Protocol contingency. Aris hammered the override codes he knew from his days as Kai, the gray market operative. The codes were old, obsolete, but derived from the same foundational architecture the fleet still used for high-security isolation. The screen stuttered, the decryption process agonizingly slow. Finally, the text resolved. It wasn't the M3 stabilization formula. It was a research log dated 6 months prior. Project M3, target emanation. Primary function, induced attractant, low frequency, ALF. Resonance. Secondary function, bioagent stabilizer, cover. Test subject vulnerability. Neuro-rot victims. Lios model. Goal. Establish control vector between human bioagent host and extra Kuiper entity, EK. Eris went cold. Not the cold of vacuum, but the absolute crushing freeze of understanding. The M3 was never a cure or a stabilizer. It was a synthetic pheromone, a beacon, a highly refined signal designed to attract the non-human energy signature accelerating toward him. The neurological rot that afflicted Leos, the thing that had driven Aris to this desperate, sacrificial mission, was not a random disease. It was the fleet's chosen vulnerability, the biological signature that guaranteed the best interaction with the extra Kuiper entity. Leos wasn't just sick. He was the control model. His suffering, his dry cough, his slow neurological decline, all were data points ensuring the M3 stabilizer, once deployed, would be the perfect, irresistible lure. And the message that had flashed before the monitor died, source Leos, was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. Leos hadn't betrayed him under coercion. The Vector Protocol override didn't need Leos to input codes. It needed Leos's unique biosignature, a low-level frequency emitted by his advanced rot, to confirm that Aris was carrying the perfect bait for the entity, rendering immediate termination, the standard Vector Protocol, obsolete. They needed the beacon deployed, not vaporized. The breath caught in Aris's throat, thick and painful. He realized the full scope of the human malice behind the cold logic of the fleet. They had engineered a disease, allowed it to ravage the colonies for years, only to use the victims' desperation and the love of their families as the delivery mechanism for a weapon designed to draw something terrible toward human space. He hadn't been a scapegoat. He had been a biological vector, fueled by familial devotion. He looked at the wreckage of the Kryptos unit, the dead screens, the pulsing static, the endless blackness. He hadn't bought time. He had run a script written in his brother's blood, his fists clenched, the metal pressing into his palms until the pain was acute. He could taste the bile rising in his throat, the sharp flavor of self-loathing. He had been so proud of his precision, his sacrifice, his duty to save Leos. He hadn't been a noble pilot. He was a trained dog, performing tricks based on Pavlovian conditioning, rooted in familial love and past guilt. The shame burned away the last remnants of Pilot Aris. He had one immediate choice, the most impossible moral calculus of his life. The M3 payload capsule was still drifting nearby, marginally pulled along by the Kryptos unit's erratic momentum. It was the source of the beacon, the heart of the trap. He could target the M3 with the salvaged unit's structural welding laser, the only operational directed energy source left. It would take 30 seconds to vaporize the capsule, destroying the chemical attractant, silencing the beacon forever. Option A. Destroy the M3. This would eliminate the immediate threat, nullifying the fleet's bioweapon test and preventing the extra Kuiper entity from reaching human space, potentially saving millions. The cost was immediate. Leos would certainly die along with every other victim of the neurological rot because the only theoretical hope for a cure would be gone, destroyed by the very person who volunteered to save them. Eris would become the silent executioner of his own brother's hope. Option B, retrieve the M3. If he secured the capsule, he could potentially use the stabilizer's complex formula against the fleet, or maybe, impossibly, still isolate the therapeutic components Dr. Ilara thought she was creating. The cost was certain. He would confirm the mission's failure, become the singular target for the accelerating entity, and he would risk turning the entity's focus or even the weapon itself into a greater danger. But Leos would remain a possibility, however slim. He looked at the small green screen, the text Leos model burning into his eyes. He remembered the last time he saw his brother, Leos's hand shaking as he tried to lift a synthetic cup of water. That image, the pure, simple vulnerability, overwhelmed the tactical and moral horror. I swore I would save him. Aris knew the pragmatist Kai would choose to vaporize the M3. One life, even a loved one, versus the potential compromise of a star system. That was the cold math of covert ops. But Aris couldn't. He couldn't carry the final, absolute burden of having chosen genocide by inaction. He had already failed Leos by being the unwitting delivery man. He would not fail him by becoming his executioner. He made the choice rooted in visceral human weakness, to preserve the lie of hope, regardless of the consequences. He slammed his hand onto the activation panel for the exterior salvage arm, the hydraulic engagement jarring the unit violently. He didn't waste time on stabilization. The Kryptos unit was still tumbling, accelerating rapidly toward the comet mass. He had seconds. The salvage arm extended, a long skeletal limb cutting through the darkness. Eris watched the external monitor feed, the faint white shape of the M3 capsule tumbling just out of reach. He manipulated the arm with frantic, brutal precision, ignoring the high-pitched shriek of the hydraulics under massive stress. 3 seconds. He grabbed the capsule, the locking mechanism flashing green. He retracted the arm, pulling the beacon, the death warrant for the entire mission, back toward the hull. The internal proximity warning screamed. Red flashing lights erupted across the dead console. The Kryptos unit had crossed the critical boundary of the invisible comet mass. The high-velocity, dense ice aggregate wasn't a solid object, but a chaotic field of massive chunks accelerating at extreme velocity. The ship didn't just shake, it was violently ripped. A catastrophic breach alert sounded, a deep, deafening howl of tearing metal and sudden depressurization. A micrometeoroid slammed into the forward hull near the comms spike, instantly venting the surrounding atmosphere into the vacuum. The cabin pressure dropped violently, forcing Eris's suit seals to lock with a painful thwack. Eris was blinded by dust and ice particles swirling in the remaining air. He slammed the emergency bulkhead switch, separating the bridge from the compromised forward section, buying himself seconds of localized pressure. He looked down at the salvaged monitor, still flickering. The M3 capsule, secured by the salvage arm, was nestled against the hull. The beacon was retrieved. The hope of Leos was secured. But the price was paid immediately and brutally. The hull integrity was compromised beyond repair, and the uncontrollable acceleration toward the deep gap was now compounded by the comet's wild gravitational field. And then, the non-human energy signature appeared on the residual map, no longer a ping, but a vast, cold outline filling the deep background. The entity had arrived. It had registered the destruction, the massive energy spike of the thrusters, the hull breach, and the successful retrieval of the M3. The entity wasn't just coming for the beacon, it was coming for the wreckage. Eris leaned back against the fractured seat, his suit hissingly fighting the vacuum of the external breach. He had chosen the impossible path, confirming that love was the most potent vector for the fleet's malice. He hadn't saved Laos's hope. He had saved the fleet's weapon. He was no longer a pilot or a ghost. He was the host. And as the entity's massive signature fully enveloped the remnants of the Kryptos unit on the screen, Eris saw one final critical piece of data that had slipped through the jamming, a detail previously hidden by the complexity of the rot data. The neurological condition suffered by Leos was not degenerative. It was symbiotic. The entity wasn't hunting a cure or a test subject. It was responding to a mating call. Eris hadn't been funneled toward a predator. He had been delivered to a partner. The last flicker of green light on the salvaged monitor died, plunging Eris into absolute, terrifying darkness as the two converging forces, the human wreckage and the extra Kuiper entity, made contact. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The price of that decision arrived faster than the light from the core worlds. The contact wasn't a metallic crash, which Eris might have been able to fight. It was a gravitational sigh, a vast, silent intake of momentum that fully arrested the Kryptos unit's chaotic tumble. The ship stopped moving against the void, but internally, Eris felt the sickening lurch of physics being overridden, his own mass resisting a new artificial anchor. The subsequent silence was worse than the static. The white noise was gone, not defeated, but absorbed. The entity, whatever it was so massive, so encompassing, that it had nullified the entire fleet jamming array simply by its presence. Eris was plunged into absolute, resonant darkness. The air in the cockpit, already thin, began to freeze rapidly. The hull breach near the comms spike was now venting not just atmosphere, but heat, leaving a biting, sterile cold that even the suit's internal regulators struggled to combat. He could see his own breath condensing inside the helmet. He reached for the salvaged M3 capsule, which the salvage arm had retracted onto the hull. He had secured the beacon, but now he realized he hadn't retrieved a cure. He had retrieved an umbilical cord. The object pulsed faintly against the cold metal, emitting a low, powerful electromagnetic hum that vibrated the very wreckage. He tried to ignite the emergency thermal coils, desperate for localized heat. No response. The surge from the EKE contact, combined with the catastrophic depressurization, had boiled away the remnants of the power core. He was a piece of debris, secured by an entity that didn't need to communicate or fight. It simply existed and controlled everything around it. He realized the symbiosis was already active. The sheer, overwhelming cold was not just environmental, it was sensory. A pressure on his mind, vast and incomprehensible, flowing through the retrieval arm and the M3 capsule, seeking him out, the host. he was being cataloged, analyzed, and accepted. The shame was a physical affliction, sharper than the cold. He had failed to be a savior, failed to be a soldier, and failed even to be a martyr. He was the perfect delivery mechanism, motivated by love, operating under guilt, and now functionally integrated into the alien system. Eris tried to pull back his hand from the M3 capsule, a panicked, primal urge to sever the connection, but his fingers were locked by the freezing temperature and a subtle, non-physical resistance. He was paralyzed in place, his face reflected in the dark, cracked durasteel, a mask of frozen sweat and absolute defeat. He searched his training, the ghost of Kai, for a countermeasure. Any countermeasure. He had no propulsion, no weapon, no communication. The only operational system was the capsule secured against the hull, which was the very thing trapping him. He was forced into a state of absolute, passive observation, the psychic pressure of the entity increasing until his teeth ached. This was the moment of complete advantage for the EKE. It didn't threaten him, it simply absorbed him. The entity sent no images, no language, only pure contextual data, the scale of its network. Eris suddenly understood the full, terrifying truth of Leos's symbiotic rot. The M3 was not a mating call for one organism. It was an activation signal for a massive, distributed intelligence operating across the outer reaches of the Kuiper Gap, a fungal intelligence that fed on neurological decay and leveraged familial bonds to expand its reach into human territory. His fists clenched, not in resistance but in total, crushing realization. He had fought the fleet's cruelty only to deliver humanity into the maw of something exponentially older and colder. Why did I fight? The question came not from calculation, but from the raw, exhausted core of his being. Why not let the fleet vaporize the M3 when they had the chance? Why condemn millions for the illusion of saving one? He felt the heavy weight of his self-imposed duty crumble into dust. He wasn't noble. He was a coward who couldn't face the finality of Leos's death or the failure of his past life as Kai. He chose the lie because it felt easier than choosing absolute certainty. He looked at the wreckage of his purpose and saw only arrogance. "You are a coward, Eris," he whispered, the sound dead in the vacuum of his helmet. "You always were. You used Laios's pain to justify your existence, and now you've sealed the fate of the colonies." It was an acceptance, a resignation to the terrifying logic of the universe. He was the problem, not the system, not the entity. Him. He had lost everything, and the only remaining choice was to accept his new role as a symbiotic host, becoming part of the fungal network that would slowly, inevitably, turn human space into a breeding ground. Then, through the absolute cold of the psychic connection, a subtle disruption registered. It wasn't the entity, and it wasn't the fleet. It was the M3 capsule itself. The capsule was designed to stabilize the bioagent, turning a lethal neurorot into a controllable symbiotic frequency. But stabilization, like everything else the fleet engineered, relied on redundancy. If the primary stabilization array failed, the secondary containment field would revert to an uncontrolled discharge state, a massive, unfiltered electromagnetic pulse. Eris suddenly remembered a fragment from Dr. Ilara's late-night rants in the Nomara lab, the fail-safe she insisted on, designed to protect the formula from the fleet's own weaponization efforts. If the capsule was retrieved by unauthorized personnel, the containment field could be overridden through a specific sequence of magnetic induction spikes. The knowledge hit him with the force of a physical blow. The psychic connection with the EKE, which was currently using Eris as its sensor bridge, provided a direct, unfiltered conduit to the M3's stabilization circuitry. He could trigger the unfiltered discharge. The option was devastating. Triggering the pulse would instantly vaporize the M3 capsule, destroying the final perfect iteration of the stabilizer, Laios's only hope. It would also generate a catastrophic electromagnetic spike, enough to overload the EKE's local symbiotic network, blinding or incapacitating the entity momentarily. The EKE would likely vaporize the wreckage, and Eris instantly in retaliation. He would die, Laios would die, but the fleet would lose their weapon, and the extra Kuiper entity would be driven back from the perimeter. Genocide by inaction would become execution by sacrifice. The choice was not between hope and despair. It was between becoming a monster's willing host or becoming a dead man who briefly achieved his final purpose. Eris lifted his hand, the frigid metal of the M3 capsule pressing against his palm. He needed to input 3 precise magnetic induction bursts using the only residual power source left, the tiny battery meant for the dead Revenant link, fed through the damaged nerve cluster in his wrist directly into the capsule's housing. It was an act of biological circuitry, using his own failing body as the ignition switch. It required absolute focus, absolute control, and guaranteed electrocution. He had maybe 20 seconds before the EKE finished integrating him completely. He inhaled deeply, fighting the desperate, paralyzing cold. He didn't think about Laios. He didn't think about the colonies. He focused only on the bitter calculus of physics and leverage. The ghost of Kai finally took the helm. Eris connected the exposed wires from the Revenant battery to the metal frame of his wrist seal. The shock was immediate, searing pain that shot up his arm, making the muscles spasm uncontrollably. He bit down hard, tasting blood again. First pulse. He held the connection, forcing the current through his numb fingers and into the capsule. The green light on the capsule housing flickered violently, struggling against the sudden massive power surge. Then, through the intense pain, a realization far worse than the immediate electrocution hit him. The symbiotic link, now overloaded, wasn't just transmitting Eris's attempt to sabotage. It was transmitting the EKE's reaction. The entity wasn't retreating. It was adapting, and it wasn't alone. Through the psychic link, Eris suddenly perceived millions of simultaneous nodes awakening far deeper in the Kuiper Gap, a staggering web of fungal consciousness spanning hundreds of millions of kilometers. His attempt to blind the local entity had acted not as a deterrent, but as a system-wide alert. And then the entity used the symbiotic link against him. It didn't send pain. It sent memory. Eris was instantly flooded with the last coherent thought of Dr. Alara, the moment before she committed suicide in the Namara labs 3 months earlier. Her final devastating realization: the M3 was never meant for the EKE at all. The fleet had designed it to attract and weaponize the entity's natural predators. The sudden surge of fear was paralyzing, utterly consuming. The EKE was terrified. Eris tried to pull his hand back to abort the second induction pulse, but his muscles failed. The shock had rendered him immobile, a conduit for the final catastrophic surge. He was not just killing Leos and himself. He was unleashing the EKE's hunter into human space, guided by the massive signal he had just amplified. The second pulse fired. The paralyzing horror of Alara's memory, the confirmation that he had summoned not a partner, but a hunter, was the final devastating piece of psychological warfare. The EKE had flooded his senses with pure, unadulterated primal dread. Eris fought the urge to vomit inside his helmet. His muscles refused to obey the command to abort the sequence. His electrocuted hand was welded to the M3 capsule housing, a slave to the circuit he had built. He was pinned between the EKE's absolute control and the terminal consequence of his actions. The only way out is through the fire. The ghost of Kai, the part of him that operated outside the parameters of hope or fear, recognized this absolute 0 point. Eris was incapable of choosing survival. Therefore, he could only choose completion. He let go of the concept of saving Leos, letting the illusion crumble under the weight of Alara's terrified memory. Leos was gone the moment the M3 was deployed. All that remained was the duty to clean up the catastrophic mess created by his own naive love. Aris forced a single minute twitch in his thumb. The movement was slow, deliberate, driven not by muscle, but by the neurological static of sheer will. He leveraged the very pain meant to paralyze him. The searing electricity from the Revenant battery coursing through the damaged nerve cluster in his wrist, using the residual feedback loop to stabilize the circuit. He didn't need to move. He needed to be a perfect conductor. The overwhelming cold of the EKE's presence became sharp, focused rage in his mind. The entity recognized the threat. Its host was performing a suicidal execution of the device it needed for defense. The symbiotic pressure intensified, trying to flatten Eris's consciousness, trying to replace his thought processes with the entity's own terrified, desperate commands. "No," Eris whispered, a sound of absolute finality, not defiance. He drove the current, forcing the last suicidal surge through the copper wires and into the M3 capsule's housing. The residual power reserve from the Revenant battery, his last piece of covert gear, drained in a single, catastrophic spike. The third pulse fired. The result was not an explosion that shattered the hull, but an instantaneous implosion of the capsule. The M3, designed to stabilize bioagents, instantly reverted its containment field into an aggressive, annihilating force. The electromagnetic pulse was massive, unfiltered, and blindingly efficient. Eris's vision went pure, screaming white. The light, contained by the EKE's silent field, was an internal detonation, vaporizing the M3 capsule and the entire hydraulic salvage arm in a millisecond flash of subatomic chaos. The metal dissolved, the wires vaporized, and the cold, parasitic presence of the EKE was violently, suddenly severed. The sheer, staggering force of the EMP slammed Eris back into his seat restraints, the impact fracturing the already compromised cockpit harness. He felt the residual energy surge through his suit, bypassing the insulation, feeling like a million needles burning his flesh from the inside out. His eardrums registered a painful, high-pitched ringing that overwhelmed even the ghost of the static. He was disoriented, half-blinded, and certain his nervous system was irrevocably fried. But the silence was absolute. The EKE was gone. Aris blinked, fighting the gray after-image burned into his retina. The Kryptos unit was now truly dead. No gauges, no residual green light, only the low-voltage emergency indicator on his helmet confirming oxygen flow. He achieved the impossible. He had destroyed the fleet's weapon and momentarily incapacitated the extra Kuiper entity. Leos's cure, the false hope, was gone forever. But the immediate crisis, the weaponization of neurological rot, was over. Then the profound silence was broken, not by the fleet's static, but by the agonizing physical return of normal physics. The EKE's massive gravitational anchor vanished, and the wreckage of the Kryptos unit was immediately slammed by the accumulated momentum it had been holding back. The ship accelerated violently, spinning uncontrollably. Thrown hard into the chaotic gravitational field of the original comet mass, Aris was battered mercilessly inside the cockpit, his injured arm screaming with pain. He fought for control, but there was no control to be had. He was a projectile, accelerating into the deep gap. He forced his trembling fingers to find the external diagnostics bus, connecting a single, salvaged fiber optic wire to his helmet display, the only way to see external data. The image flickered into painful resolution. The EKE's core signature was still present, far off axis, temporarily inert, dealing with the catastrophic EMP damage to its local network. Aris had achieved his tactical objective, but the victory was instantly negated by the arrival of the hunter. A new signature dominated the field. It was fast, incredibly dense, and running cold. A massive, streamlined gravitational distortion entering the Kuiper gap from the deep void, precisely where the M3 had been deployed. The EMP Aris fired had been a massive flare, a final, irresistible signal broadcasting the exact death site of the bait. Aris's actions had not averted the disaster. They had streamlined the invasion. The true threat had arrived, drawn by the final, violent energy spike. And worse, the signature of the hunter was not monolithic. It was a massive swarm, hundreds of individual high-velocity elements moving with coordinated lethal efficiency. These were the predators Dr. Alara had tried to warn him about. Then, through the high-pitched ringing in his ears, a ghost transmission whispered across the open, unfiltered fiber line. It was not EKE data. It was fleet comms, now functioning erratically, distorted and faint, having momentarily pierced the EKE's silent field before the hunter's gravitational shadow clamped down. He recognized the voice. Commander Vektar, the architect of the protocol, speaking to the drone recovery asset that was still lurking near the perimeter. The target has achieved full dispersal of the M3 component. The attractant has been maximized. Retrieval of the pilot is now secondary. Calculate projected interception path for the... Wait. The M3 signature is defunct. The component is neutralized. The pilot has destroyed the stabilizer. A moment of cold, absolute silence from Vektar. Then a voice thick with calculated, murderous fury. He chose the ethical impossibility. Calculate immediate, irreversible termination of the pilot, but first, divert the recovery drone. The primary objective has changed. The pilot is now irrelevant. The hunter must be controlled, not merely drawn. Aris watched the drone signature on his helmet display. It didn't move toward him. It turned, accelerating hard, moving towards the coordinates of the first EKE contact, the spot where the M3 was supposed to lure the predator, not the current wreckage. The fleet's calculation was immediate and ruthless. Eris was dead weight. The Hunter was the new weapon. They intended to try and capture the EKE's predator using the residual gravitational signature of the weakened EKE as bait. Eris had not only summoned the threat, but had confirmed the fleet's belief that this level of weaponization was possible. He had paid the cost of the cure, only to validate the entire monstrous project. The Kryptos unit was now caught in a dangerous gravitational resonance, oscillating wildly between the pull of the comet mass and the incoming swarm of hunters. Eris tried to move his left arm, the arm that held the revenant wires during the pulse. It was heavy, numb, and refused to respond beyond a painful, weak spasm. The neurological damage was total. He was alive, but broken, drifting, and irrelevant. He looked through the viewport into the blackness where the swarm was rapidly approaching. The sight was not terrifying, but profoundly peaceful. He had accepted his fate the moment he fired the third pulse. He had chosen death over integration, the certainty of ending Leos's hope over the uncertainty of compounding the fleet's cruelty. He slumped against the restraints, feeling the cold exhaustion settle into his bones. It was over. But then, his malfunctioning right hand, which had been resting on the environmental control panel, registered a faint, low-frequency vibration through the dead metal. It wasn't the swarm. It wasn't the comet. It was inside the ship. The only piece of technology that had survived the EMP and the EKE surge. The highly shielded, independent emergency beacon. He had completely forgotten about Bia was cycling for activation. It wasn't fleet hardware. It was designed by Dr. Alara, installed secretly during the construction of the Kryptos unit, as an emergency distress call only to be activated when the M3 stabilizer achieved critical deployment parameters and was immediately destroyed by vector protocol, the expected execution. Alara's final, hidden, fail-safe. The beacon was designed to transmit one thing, a low-frequency, highly encrypted distress call, not to the fleet. The intended recipient was Leos. Eris stared at the internal panel, the faint internal hum growing slightly stronger. Leos's biological signature, the thing that had enabled the vector protocol override, was now the destination of the last working transmitter. Eris had failed to be the savior. He had failed to be the weapon. He had achieved the ultimate failure, and that failure had unlocked Alara's final, desperate attempt to communicate the truth to the one person the fleet controlled completely. The Hunter swarm was closing fast, its massive gravitational wake beginning to tear at the wreckage. Eris was pinned. He couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't stop the transmission. He was left only with the final, horrifying realization. He had destroyed the cure and summoned the Hunter, but in doing so, he had become the perfect, undeniable witness. His sacrifice had paved the way for the transmission of the truth to the Leos model, the captive heart of the fleet's operation. The internal hum reached full cycle. The transmission began, a silent, powerful spike of data racing back toward the core systems. Eris's breath hitched in the frozen air of his helmet. He had saved humanity from the EKE only to directly imperil his brother. He had won the battle for morality, but only by setting the stage for the war against the man he loved most. The hunters were upon him. The time for running was over. The time for the truth was just beginning. A gravidade não o soltou. O momento em que o enxame de caçadores chegou não foi um impacto destrutivo. Foi uma transição de fase. O fim da física que Ares conhecia. O Kryptos Unit, arrebentado, quebrado e girando descontroladamente, de repente foi estabilizado. O campo gravitacional caótico do cometa desapareceu, substituído pela atração coordenada e fria das centenas de objetos que compunham o enxame. Eles não o estavam destruindo, estavam o garantindo. Ares ficou inconsciente por um período que não conseguia calcular. Quando acordou, não havia mais frio. A cabine, embora ainda cheia de micropartículas de gelo e destroços, estava envolvida em uma estranha e uniforme temperatura interna. O buraco no casco, onde o módulo de comunicação fora arrancado, estava selado não por metal, mas por uma membrana bioluminescente, pulsando com um verde fraco e orgânico. Ele não estava mais à deriva. Estava sendo transportado. Ele tentou mexer o braço esquerdo, o que tinha sido o condutor do pulso EMP. Nenhuma resposta, exceto uma dor aguda e seca que percorria o ombro. O dano neural era total, uma consequência física permanente da sua escolha. Sua mão direita, que o Kai de outrora usaria para o trabalho cirúrgico, tremia agora, um movimento fino e constante, como se tentasse sintonizar uma frequência que não existia. Ele era um técnico que nunca mais poderia confiar no próprio toque. O monitor do capacete, conectado ao último cabo de fibra óptica, mostrava o enxame de caçadores. Não eram naves. Eram organismos gigantescos, aerodinâmicos, movendo-se com a precisão de um cardume. Eles não emitiam sinais eletromagnéticos perceptíveis, apenas uma vasta, silenciosa sombra gravitacional que engolia a luz das estrelas distantes. Ares era o centro desta sombra, o troféu. O custo da sua vitória se materializou na forma de um novo terror. Ele havia impedido que a frota usasse o M3, mas havia garantido que os predadores chegassem ao sistema humano, guiados pelo farol que ele acendeu. E agora, ele próprio era um farol, movendo-se mais rápido do que qualquer nave humana seria capaz, arrastado para o desconhecido. A única coisa que o mantinha ligado à humanidade era a pequena vibração no painel que indicava que a transmissão de Elara havia sido concluída. Aquele pico de dados, a verdade sobre o modelo Lewis e o esquema da frota, havia sido enviado. Tinha chegado ao seu destino. Ares sentiu o peso da nova realidade. Ele havia condenado Lewis para salvar a frota de si mesma. Ele se forçou a pensar, não em planos de fuga. A fuga era impossível, mas no que a verdade significaria para o irmão. Lios era o vetor biológico, o refém perfeito. Se a frota soubesse que ele havia recebido a verdade, Lios seria imediatamente desmantelado, não por vingança, mas para eliminar a vulnerabilidade. O peso daquele conhecimento era mais esmagador do que a aceleração que sentia. Ele tinha feito a escolha ética, destruindo a arma biológica. Mas a ética, descobriu, era um luxo que exigia um preço impossível de pagar. Ele não era mais o piloto Aris, o homem de dever, nem o fantasma Kai, o homem de cálculo. Era algo diferente, algo mais frio e mais definitivo. Era a testemunha, permanentemente exilado, incapacitado e irrelevante para a frota, mas inestimável para o enxame. E o que era pior? Ele era o agente que havia plantado a verdade no coração do controle inimigo. Ele estava em uma cela de carne e energia, sendo transportado para o seu novo papel. Os dias que se seguiram foram uma sucessão de escuridão e movimento constante. Ares não tentou comer, não sentia fome, não tentou dormir. O zumbido constante da membrana orgânica que envolvia a cabine tornava o sono impossível. Sua mente, porém, estava estranhamente calma. A agonia da escolha tinha terminado. A culpa não o paralisava mais. Ela o definia. Ele era o resultado final de uma equação falha. Amor, paz, dever, desastre em escala cósmica. Ele observou o tremor em sua mão direita. Não era um tremor de medo, mas uma falha mecânica. Ele tentou lembrar-se do gosto do café sintético de Nomara, do cheiro de metal esterilizado. A fragilidade daquela vida, a mentira daquela missão eram quase cômicas agora. Ele havia estado tão focado na honra da missão, na perfeição técnica do lançamento, que havia ignorado a lição fundamental. As máquinas falham, os humanos traem, mas a física é implacável. Ele não sentia mais a necessidade de justificar suas ações. A frota o queria morto. O Ecker o queria integrado. Os caçadores o queriam estudado. Todas as intenções externas tinham se alinhado para o mesmo resultado, a sua remoção permanente do sistema. Ele havia aceitado isso. A única coisa que importava era a transmissão enviada. Ele havia sacrificado a cura de Lewis, mas garantido sua liberdade de informação. E a informação, no final, era o que a frota temia mais do que qualquer arma. Ares fechou os olhos, inclinado sobre o console que agora parecia um monumento de destruição pessoal. A sua luta não tinha sido por redenção, tinha sido por teimosia, por recusar-se a ser um peão em um jogo que não valorizava a vida humana. Ele havia perdido o jogo, mas destruído o tabuleiro. A nave seguiu em frente, mergulhando cada vez mais fundo na vastidão não mapeada do vazio. O zumbido da membrana orgânica sobre o casco era o único som. A frota nunca o alcançaria aqui, nem o perdão, nem a absolvição. Ele aceitou o que restava, a responsabilidade silenciosa, a responsabilidade por Lewis, que agora lutava uma guerra que Ares iniciou, a responsabilidade por cada colônia que o enxame de caçadores pudesse ameaçar. Ele não podia consertar o mundo. Ele só podia ser a única testemunha que contaria a verdade de um lugar de exílio final. A escuridão do espaço exterior não era mais o vácuo gelado que ele havia sentido antes da implosão do M3. Era um campo de força, um abraço alienígena, quente e pesado. Ele estava além da borda, além de toda jurisdição. A sensação do ozônio, mais acentuada do que o ar reciclado deveria permitir, era a primeira pista de que algo estava fundamentalmente errado no início desta jornada. Agora, o ar reciclado, o ozônio, o cheiro de metal e de casa, tudo isso havia desaparecido. Ele estava sendo transportado para casa. Ele estava além do Palace, além do Gap, onde o tempo se dobrava e a luz morria. Sua missão estava completa. A mentira havia terminado. Ele estava sendo puxado mais fundo no infinito escuro. O cheiro de ozônio, de tecnologia humana, estava finalmente ausente. Apenas o vácuo permaneceu, absoluto e silencioso. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions and share this episode with someone who still believes in science